Hi, my name is Caroline Poland, and I'm the founder and CEO of Poland and Associates Consulting. And today I want to do a video on compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, really speaking to those of you who might be listening who are people helpers or on the front lines right now during this difficult and uncertain time with COVID-19. And this will just be really skimming the surface of this content, but this is something that I really love to talk about and really desire to help those of you who are helpers. I want to start off by sharing one of my favorite quotes to use when talking about compassion fatigue, and it is by Henry Nouwen, and it says this: "Who can listen to a story of loneliness and despair without taking the risk of experiencing similar pain in his own heart and even losing his precious peace of mind? In short, who can take away suffering without entering it?" And I believe that's such a powerful quote when we talk about people helping, because as people helpers, and especially those of you on the front lines right now, you're running into situations with deep suffering, suffering yourselves in the middle of that. And yet that's what we choose to do when we're choosing a people helping profession. So one of the foundations that I use when talking about compassion fatigue is the compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue model. And in this model, we can see that compassion satisfaction, or just those positive aspects of helping, are on one side, and compassion fatigue, which we would identify as some of those negative aspects of helping, is on the other. And then that's broken down into two categories: burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And today I'm not going to focus too much on burnout, but I am going to focus on compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. The reality is that compassion fatigue is just the cost of caring. We found that it's really those who are empathetic that experience this. And so again, this is not a failing on your part. It is simply the cost of caring. It really is relatively impossible at some point, if we're in the people helping field for a while, to avoid some of this cost of caring, but it is possible to stay healthy and regulate in the middle of that, and that's what I want to focus on today. So what does compassion fatigue really look like? Well, here are a number of different warning signs of compassion fatigue, burnout, secondary traumatic stress. And again, we want to be very curious about what the root cause of these are. So each of these things could be attributed to many other experiences, illnesses, realities in our life. And so we don't want to just see one of these things and assume compassion fatigue. But if you're noticing some of these signs in yourself or a loved one, it's time to get curious and want to do some of that deeper work and understanding what the root cause of some of these symptoms are. So again, these are just some of the early warning signs. If you're starting to notice those, be very curious about what's going on and do some of that deeper work to assess whether or not this is compassion fatigue or a result of burnout or secondary traumatic stress in your life. With secondary traumatic stress, what we're looking at is a very gradual escalation of symptoms. So we don't just drop into secondary traumatic stress. Most of us, because of our training or our programs that we went to as a people helper, we have learned how to navigate some of the stresses of our job. And so we can withstand quite a bit of hardship or witnessing traumatic incidents for quite some time until we hit this moment in time where we can no longer take it. And that threshold is a little bit different for each of us, but we all have a threshold. And so the thing that pushes us over the threshold doesn't even have to be a major event, but it's just this slow, steady buildup and accumulation of events that suddenly lead us to reaching that threshold. And therefore we hit that barrier and flip over into experiencing secondary traumatic stress. One of the things that we're looking at with secondary traumatic stress is this idea of intrusive thoughts. And intrusive thoughts are simply thinking about what you don't want to think about. They begin to predominate, and you start to think about work when you're not at work, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you are thinking about work or dreaming about work. And again, on occasion, this is normal, but when this starts to happen more and more, where this work is intruding into our thoughts, again, that's a warning sign that we're moving more towards secondary traumatic stress. One of the other things that lead to secondary traumatic stress for us is the mirror neurons in our brain. So when we are witnessing or hearing stories of trauma, deep hurt, and pain, the mirror neurons that we have in our brain are actually activated within the listening process. And so what the mirror neurons do is it begins to create a video of what's happening. And so we start to experience the story or the reality as if it is happening to us. And so we start to experience other people's reality in these flecks of trauma. Now, certainly this trauma is not the same as the trauma in PTSD, but we start to be picking up these little flecks of trauma over and over and over again from the stories that we're hearing, the hurt that we are witnessing, and the pain that we are bearing witness to. So we aren't a witness anymore. And when that happens, our sympathetic nervous system begins to experience more and more perceptions of a threat. And when we perceive a threat, that sympathetic nervous system activates and we go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, again, experiencing the world through this activated nervous system. And the more we experience the world through an activated nervous system, the more likely we are to then encode experiences as trauma. As well, when we hit that fight or flight system, we're not able to regulate our emotions in the same way. We're not able to regulate our thought process in the same way because we're back in our survival brain and we've turned off the executive function that comes in our prefrontal cortex. So again, I think it's important to remember that no matter what we do, we are going to be impacted by the world of people sharing, by the stories that we hear from our loved ones, by the stories of those that we sit with at their bedside, maybe in a hospital, or what we hear over the phone. We are going to be infected by this. That, again, that's just the cost of caring. It's not a failure on your part. So it's what we do with that when that begins to happen that leads us to this experience of secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, or if we're able to stay on this other side in compassion satisfaction. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Pullen and Associates, and I will be continuing to put out videos on mental health and wellness during this time.